It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Friday, August 23rd, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Reno, Nevada, I am John Ramey. Fed Chief Powell says cut. And deadly floods smash Bangladesh just after bloody protests led to the ouster of their autocrat leader. And is the continued violence in Bangladesh political or religious in nature, or both? Also, Democratic nominee Kamala Harris signals her intention to keep the United States engaged in the world. Sam Park, let us begin with our favorite deadhead, Fed Chair Jerome Powell. This is reporting from CNBC. Powell laid the groundwork Friday, that is today, for interest rate cuts ahead, although he declined to provide exact indications on timing or extent. In a related story, Sam Park, the Dow Jones closed up 450 points.
You don't say.
Quoting from Powell, the time has come for policy to adjust. The direction of travel is clear, and the timing and pace of rate cuts will depend on incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks.
Yeah, guess what? They're going to start next month.
Yeah. Powell also took time, and I really enjoyed this, to talk about why inflation happened. And there seems to be what I can only guess or assume is like a not entirely good faith attempt to pin inflation in this country on specific policies of the Biden administration. And some of the incorrect arguments about the nature of inflation have been illegal immigration, deficit spending, right? These are problems to be solved. There's no question about it. But Jerome Powell said the good ship transitory was a crowded one. That was a good line, right?
Yeah, I thought so too.
Because remember when the inflation spike hit in 21, he said it's transitory, and Powell pointed out that all the smart people thought that.
Well, not all of them, but quite a few people did.
Many of the smart people thought that. But Powell said today the rise in inflation was, quote, a global phenomenon, the result of, quote, rapid increases in the demand for goods, strained supply chains, tight labor markets, and sharp hikes in commodity prices. And he also pointed out that when the inflation spread, and I hadn't thought about it in such kind of an infectious metaphor, but when it spread from goods, you can understand why supply chains might make goods go up to services.
Yes.
That's when they took action to raise rates. So I want to eradicate the talking point that illegal immigration or deficit spending somehow caused inflation in the United States, somehow caused inflation. I understand those can exacerbate it, but this, as the Fed chair says, it was a global phenomenon.
Okay. Now, first of all, I think that immigration of any kind, whether legal or illegal, almost certainly helped reduce inflation. Because if in general, when immigrants work in this country, whether they're legal or illegal, if they've just gotten here, they work for lower wages than native-born people. So if that helps hold down wages, that's going to help hold down inflation. So on that score, I'd say you're absolutely right. With the deficit spending, I think that Powell was perhaps a little bit disingenuous, not very, but the nature of the deficit spending makes a difference. For example, if you're just sending people money, whether by a direct deposit or sending them checks in the mail, I'm sorry, that's going to add to inflation, right?
Yes, but not in England.
No,
not around
certainly
the globe.
not. But Powell's mandate, that is the Federal Reserve's mandate, doesn't extend to England. Okay, and so it was certainly not one of the primary causes of inflation, but it's not going to make inflation any better. But
I understand. I don't mean to make a political defense of the Biden administration's economic policies. I want us to be able to have good faith arguments about the economy, and that seems to be a hard thing to do.
It's always going to be a hard thing to do, and it's especially going to be a hard thing to do during an election year, right? But also, just as a general matter, we talk about politics, and you and I are guilty of this on this podcast. We sort of pretend that there's some barrier between economics and politics, and of course there isn't, right? I mean, the fact is that goods and services are exchanged for currency, and currency is maintained by the government. And that's just the way things have always been. And so there's always going to be some overlap between politics and economics. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to discuss them in sort of discrete terms from one another, but we need to at least acknowledge that there's always going to be an intersection and a sort of interchange between those two realms.
Powell also said, quote, our actions forcefully demonstrated our commitment to restoring price stability. An important takeaway from recent experience is that anchored inflation expectations, reinforced by vigorous central bank actions, can facilitate disinflation without the need for slack. Powell also said there's, quote, much to be learned. And then he said, and this is a great quote, that is my assessment of events. Your mileage may differ.
I thought that was very good also.
That was pretty good. I mean, again, these are central bankers. These aren't comedians.
No, I know. But I mean, Powell, even among central bankers, has a very sort of distinctive persona. He's a bit of a nebbish, frankly, which is unusual, right? Usually you want someone very sort of not stern necessarily, but sort
austere.
of imposing in some level, right? And he's certainly not that. I think that's one of the reasons why he gets so much, garbage from so many commentators, and he just kind of comes off as an easy target. Whereas somebody like, Ben Bernanke or not to mention Alan Greenspan, right? I mean, to say nothing at all of Paul Volcker, who was, like 6'8" or something, right? I mean, Powell just sort of seems like he's a bit of a pushover. And I think that's unfair, right? But that's just the way things go.
Well, he pushed over inflation, Sam. So who's the pushover now?
Well, exactly. And so I think I also found it interesting to hear the remarks he made about the employment situation right now, where he made a point of mentioning that although unemployment has ticked up to 4.3%, which is its highest level during this episode, he mentioned that that's mainly because of a slowdown in hiring as opposed to lots of layoffs, right? It's just that companies aren't hiring as many people as they were before, and more people are entering the workforce. For example, just a month or two ago, a bunch of people graduated from college, right? So, they're going to be entering the workforce as of now. That happens every year, obviously.
Yeah, summer is seasonally kind of
yes, and so
prone to this.
Exactly, and this I think helped probably assuage some concerns about the data that was published yesterday, in which the Bureau of Labor Statistics had an annual revision of jobs figures, in which it turned out that some 818,000 jobs that they thought had been created over the past year, turns out they weren't, right?
So nearly a million.
Yeah, but that's a pretty high level, right? But that's still only about 60,000 or so jobs per month, right?
It's not net job loss.
No, certainly not, right? But it's just sort of seems like a big miss. But the point is that it would seem that the medicine that the Fed was applying to the economy all through the past year was actually working better than people thought it was, right? Because people thought if the economy's still creating this many jobs, and the Fed's never going to cut interest rates, right? Because it means the economy is still running too hot. But now, if it seems that it's not actually running so hot, I think this helped influence the Federal Reserve's decision to cut interest rates, which they did not say is definitely going to happen next month, but I think everybody is very sure that it will.
So the Fed hiked rates 11 times from March 2022 through July 2023. Now, I just want to point out that's CNBC's reporting. The inflationary spike, the period, began in March 2021. So they took a year before they really started tightening the screws. And again, I think that's what you want from your central bank. You want incremental, deliberate, not rash, and not kind of, we want small little lane changes, right? You don't want big garish movement.
Yeah, I think in general that's true, but they might have started raising rates earlier if they
A
hadn't been
little,
so convinced that
it was
inflation was
transitory.
transitory,
Right.
right? And so what it took a while for the good ship transitory to spring a leak, right? And it ended up being kind of a large leak, so they had to
I,
patch it up very quickly.
I want to normalize or kind of colloquialize transitory, like when something's really messed up, but you don't want to actually acknowledge it in the short term. You can just say, oh, it's transitory, like
I
just a
guess.
flesh
I
wound.
mean, honestly, I think
If I
that
get a flat tire, I'm just going to say it's transitory.
I think a large part of what happened was just that uh, it had been such a long time since the United States had experienced a serious
Right.
inflationary
A
episode.
lifetime, really.
Yeah, that's right. Or a couple generations that there was a very little institutional culture of knowing exactly how to go about this. That is on a day by day basis, right? And of course, uh, because the inflation was touched off by the end of the pandemic, which was a once in a century event, right? It was a sort of sui generis inflationary episode. It wasn't like, it wasn't caused by the same things that the last episode in the 70s and 80s had been caused. And so I think if it was difficult for the Federal Reserve to come up with a very, very, a perfect plan to deal with this, I think anybody should be able to forgive them. The problem is that the stakes are very high.
Yeah, certainly central banking is an inexact science.
Yes, that's right.
Any other thoughts about, I would also just like to shout out the central bank for always going to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a place I've never been, but I understand it to be gorgeous.
Well,
It's kind of a flex.
I've driven by there, but
Yeah.
I've never actually stopped in Jackson Hole.
It'd be like if the UN met in Yosemite or something. It's just like, oh, okay.
Yes,
Good
and
choice, guys.
apparently, well, they go every year, right? And one thing I only learned about it this year is that it's actually sponsored by the Kansas City Fed, right? Which is one of the number of regional branches of the Federal Reserve.
Now, I'm not a geographer, Sam, but I do know that Missouri is not Wyoming.
No, and so there, I think I can't remember exactly how many branches of the Fed there are. I think there's like a half a dozen, right?
Yeah,
But
that
that is
seems
the
right.
close.
About like circuit courts, maybe a bit fewer.
Yeah, but apparently that is the closest one, right? And so I just found that sort of interesting, and as a kind of, I think it's sort of a historical relic, frankly, right?
So the Kansas City Fed goes, hey, we got Jackson Hole in our district. Let's use it.
Yes, right. So they host the annual Federal Reserve retreat at Jackson Hole.
That's a good note, Sam, that it's the Kansas City Fed's
Yeah, I
trip.
thought so. It's just,
That's a real good note.
Yeah,
You're not getting that on CNBC, guys.
Actually, I mean, I think they
Oh,
do
maybe
mention it in the body of the story, right? They're not going to.
disregard. I'll cut it. Okay, can we move to Bangladesh?
Please.
Okay, this is fascinating. So, just a little peek behind the curtain. You had sent me a story about the political situation in Bangladesh, and I, very rigorously I just Google whatever topic generally, and the news about Bangladesh is about flooding right now. So this is New York Times reporting from earlier today. Floods in Bangladesh have killed at least 13 people and affected millions of others in the country's northeast, adding to the challenges of an interim government struggling to return order to a country plunged into anarchy after mass protest forced out its autocratic leader. Now, we have been following the deposal, is that the correct word, of Sheikh Hasina, the one-time democratic savior turned autocrat, turned deposed leader of Bangladesh, who fled protests a couple of weeks ago. Hasina's government killed 300 of the protesters before finally giving up power. Now you've got Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus running a caretaker government. They're trying to restore order. There has been kind of a power vacuum. Police have finally ended their strike. Remember
Yes.
our last episode, it was basically like the student protesters were either directing traffic or beating up members of the Awami League, which of course is the party of the former leader, Hasina, who's been kicked out of office. There is, and I was unaware of this, Sam, until you sent me this story. There is a very neat demographic cleavage between the Awami League, Hasina's political base, and the rest of the country, the protesters, the folks that threw her out of office.
And the traditional opposition party, the Bangladeshi National Party.
Right. The Bangladeshi National Party is Muslim. The Awami League is Hindu. Well, the Awami League, I should say, is Hindu. Explicitly.
No. They're not Hindu. Okay. They are friendly with the Hindu minority. Okay. Bangladesh is
they're not explicitly a Hindu party, but yes.
Not at all, right? I mean, the Bangladesh is an overwhelmingly Muslim country. The Hindu minority is only about 8% of the country. Now, but still, in a country of 170 million people, that's what, 13, 14 million people. And as we've mentioned before, it's one of the most densely populated countries on earth. So all of the Hindu people of Bangladesh live very close by with their Muslim neighbors who are the great majority of the country. But as we mentioned before, the Awami League is the successor organization of the winning side in a civil war. And it's worth pointing out that in any civil war, especially a war of secession, in the case of Bangladesh, there were plenty of people in Bangladesh who wanted to remain part of Pakistan, which is the country that Bangladesh broke away from. And their political successor organization generally is the BNP. And so the Awami League, since they were the separatists from Pakistan, they got military assistance from India, right? The, of course, overwhelming Hindu majority country next door and eternal enemy at that point of Pakistan. And so Hindus have always been associated, right or wrong, with the Awami League. And in a Muslim majority country, you are always going to find Muslim religious extremists, especially in a country as large as Bangladesh. Even if only 1% of Bangladeshis are Muslim extremists, that's still 1.7 million people. That's plenty to cause trouble, right? We have religious extremists in our country. They have religious extremists exist in many countries around the world. So we shouldn't expect Bangladesh to be any different. So since the government of Sheikh Hasina has fallen, in many ways, it's simply just Muslim extremists and bigots of many kinds that don't even have to be all that extreme, just taking advantage of the power vacuum in the country and the striking police, as you pointed out, to just pick on Hindus because they don't like them. And so that's what's been happening.
I'm glad you pointed out that I had mischaracterized the Awami League as the Hindu party because, of course, the whole point of the Awami League and Hasina's ascent to power was that she was secular.
Yes.
But now, in the vacuum, Hindus are being terrorized.
Yes.
And now there's an element of misinformation in this story. So on social media, there are, am I correct in understanding, exaggerated reports of the levels of violence against Hindus that some think that messaging is coming from India, right? Because India is the overwhelmingly Hindu majority next door neighbor.
Yes, and has always maintained very good relations with the Awami League.
Sure.
Although they have with both parties, to be frank.
So we do know that Hindus are being terrorized.
Yes.
But there may be some exaggeration within some media ecosystems.
It's certainly possible. It's hard to get a good read on the story, frankly. I think the most interesting part to me about this episode of intercommunal violence is that much as many of the student protesters who toppled the government later started directing traffic in the capital after the police went on strike, quite a few of them have taken to guarding the homes of their Hindu neighbors and helping again to arrest the potential slide into chaos that their country is in danger of slipping into. And I think this is amazing because, for instance, all this year, John, we've talked about in Electorama 2024, the sort of different expressions and conditions of democracy throughout the world. We've covered elections by now on every inhabited continent. And so Bangladesh, even among those stories, really stands out. As you recall, it was the first election that we covered just by coincidence because it took place on January 7th of this year. And since then, we've talked about some elections that are good and some elections that are not so good. And Bangladesh's election was not so good. We've also talked about a couple of democratic governments that have been toppled by military coup, right? This is something that, happens from time to time in different places.
I just want to point out, when you say not so good, we mean not so free and not so fair.
Exactly.
We're not talking about the result. We're talking about the transparency and
the process of it. Yeah, the process of the election, that is. In Bangladesh alone, amongst all the countries we've talked about, we've had a popular uprising that toppled an elected government that was on a seemingly inexorable slide towards outright authoritarianism, having been in power already for 15 years and consolidating its own power after their last election, which was neither free nor fair. Bangladesh is the only country that's undergoing anything like this. And so I think it bears keeping an eye on to see how this is going to play out over the coming weeks and months. It's very precarious, but this idea of the protesters stepping forward, or at least some of them stepping forward to try and maintain order, I think it's remarkable and sort of inspiring. Last week, we talked about some protesters who I took the perhaps a bit of liberty in describing as proto-Jacobin, right? And who just wanted to purge the system of all loyalists of the previous regime, and that how this could result in just pure chaos, right? Not that I have any good feelings toward the previous regime because they were terrible, right? But somebody's got to run the civil service. And then there were these other protesters who were guarding their neighbors' homes or directing traffic and things like this, who you, I think, very astutely described as Boy Scouts, right? And I think, one thing, we should probably at least speculate that there might be more overlap between these two categories than we would like to think, right? Sure. Just because you're directing traffic doesn't mean you like Hindus, right?
You might direct traffic and try to keep order, but maybe also want to, beat up a Hindu here or there.
Yeah, all right. And so I think that we shouldn't discount that possibility. But as Prime Minister Yunus tries to figure out how to move forward, I think he's got an asset in his pocket that I'm sure he probably realizes. And I think, for instance, his background is in microcredit, which involves giving small loans to would-be entrepreneurs to try and start a business, right? And the problem, of course, is that these are people generally who have no credit history whatsoever. So you can have difficulty trying to assess their creditworthiness. But he can apply some of the same sort of judgment, I think, towards trying to figure out how to staff these suddenly vacant positions. Because if I were him, I would just be sending people out to interview volunteer traffic cops, right? And just say, hey, kid.
You seem civically minded.
Yeah, what's your name, right? Here's my phone number, and have each one of these people take a picture of themselves on their phone standing next to Muhammad Yunus, right? And say, I work for Prime Minister Yunus. Here's a picture of me standing with him. Now, it's great that you're directing traffic. And if you want to keep doing that, that's great. And maybe we'll try and put you on the payroll, right? So you're not just taking time out of your life to do this. But if there's something else you want to do, we're going to have some vacancies. And if you were a student, uh, we'd like to find out what you were studying and where maybe we could put your talents to some sort of better use. Uh, and and do me a favor, don't tell a lot of people about this, because we want people like you who have already stepped forward to volunteer, right? If word gets out that uh, becoming a volunteer traffic cop is some sort of fast track to getting a government job, we're just going to be overwhelmed by opportunists. The people we want are people like you who have already come forward. Oh, and by the way, one person that you should tell about this is your sister, if she's already a student, because part of the microcredit was trying to empower female entrepreneurs, right? But ask your mom and dad first, right? Because we kind of figured that if they're okay with their daughter getting an education, they're probably okay with her getting a government job too, but we don't want to assume that, right? So ask them first, and if they say it's okay, then have your sister give me a call. But for you, give me a call when your shift ends. Let's talk about this. And I would be shocked, actually, if they hadn't started doing something like this already.
So it is, I mean, truly, there's like this kind of grassroots community movement to maintain order. And then you've got these floods. The country's Ministry of Disaster Management says the regions, again, this is in the Northeast. I don't know how up to speed you are on the regions of Bangladesh. Feni and Kumila were the worst hit. Communication lines have been affected. Almost all cell phone towers losing electricity. Rail service suspended. Roads damaged. That makes it hard to bring emergency aid. The Army and Navy of Bangladesh have been deployed for rescue operations. Residents describing the water levels, this is from the New York Times, beyond any they had seen in recent years. So this is kind of a confluence of the stories we find ourselves coming back to, especially in the global South, right? Not only is democracy in the global South perhaps most precarious, I think we can make that assertion.
I think so.
They're also on the firing line. They're like, they're writing point on the climate crisis.
That's right. And if neighboring India wants to earn some goodwill back with the people of Bangladesh, they should be sending helicopters full of aid to Bangladesh right now, and maybe people to help out. And perhaps Prime Minister Yunus wants to, corral some of these volunteer traffic cops, right? Say, look, we're going to need people to help distribute aid. If you want to help out, which you seem to want to do, let's go, right? Directing traffic is great, but there's people in big trouble right now. And I think that there's an opportunity here. This could all go to hell tomorrow, okay? But there's a spirit amongst a large number of young people in Bangladesh who seem to want to make sure that doesn't happen. And that sort of spirit doesn't always arise when governments are toppled. And I find it, as I said before, just rather inspiring that it's happened in this case. It's really just quite remarkable.
So Bangladesh maintains, what is that, 3-episode streak here on Working for Crusoe. It's
yes.
A fascinating, potentially terrifying time.
Yes,
we will continue to monitor what's going on in Bangladesh.
I think it's warranted that it's taken up so much of our attention, just because it is the most distinctive episode of all the sort of.
It's a quintessential example of kind of what we're,
absolutely on every level, right? I mean, there's an economic angle, there's a political angle, there's a climate change angle, the whole fate of democracy globally angle. It touches everything, and it's important country in global supply chains. It's got everything we ever talk about.
Vice President Kamala Harris accepted the nomination of the Democratic Party yesterday in Chicago, and she talked some foreign policy, and she drew, I thought, a rather marked contrast, a distinction, an unmistakable distinction between her vision for American foreign policy and the Donald Trump MAGA vision, which is described as America first by the proponents and would be described by anybody who's ever studied the subject matter as isolationism. We know as a historical truth, isolationism is bad. Google the 1930s if you don't believe me. But it is rearing its ugly head again. And in the MAGA movement, they don't think the United States needs to be involved internationally in the way that it has been since the end of the Second World War. They don't really seem to be interested in maintaining the Pax Americana. They don't seem to be all that interested in NATO. Donald Trump has been explicit about that. I thought Kamala Harris used pretty simple language in stating that she supports NATO and she intends to maintain vigorous alliances with America's friends and partners around the globe. How'd you take it?
I think that's right. Honestly, I think most of what she was saying was just a continuation of the Joe Biden policy, right?
Which we have been very complimentary of in unbelievably fraught times.
That's
globally.
Right. And I think that people like me who have been disappointed with how President Biden has handled the situation in Gaza will continue to be disappointed should Vice President Harris achieve the presidency, right? I think that her policy, as I've said before, will be very similar to Joe Biden's. It might be different here and there, but I don't expect it to be any sort of radical departure. But as time goes on and the election draws nearer, we'll be able to talk about the differences between Vice President Harris and former President Trump in both foreign policy and economic policy. For instance, after they have their debate on September 10th, we can really dive into these things, because at that point, I expect that there will be some level of substantive discussion about in both of those arenas. For example, Vice President Harris a week ago today gave a speech about economic policy. But as we mentioned before, it was really just a political speech. She did outline some interesting ideas, but she didn't put a lot of meat on the bones. And so I think it's going to take a little while before we have a detailed idea of what those policies are going to amount to. For example, there were innumerable headlines about what people seem to think was her proposal to institute price controls, even though she didn't say anything at all about price controls. And I think that this is really just political. For example, any president that takes office, when she brings a package of legislation to Congress, has to have something that she's willing to give up, right? And since her
just from a negotiation standpoint.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think that because her proposed federal ban on price gouging for groceries was the last thing on her list in her speech, I think that'll be the thing that's going to fall off the bottom of that list. I don't know. We won't find out unless she actually wins. But this whole thing about price controls, I don't know where it comes from. Maybe some campaign staffer leaked it overnight the night before the speech, because a couple of different outlets had it in their headlines. And I hope that's not the case, because if they're considering price controls, it's a terrible idea. As I've mentioned on this show before, price controls do not work. If anything, they make inflation worse. The other thing also is that we know that inflation is slowly falling, right? By the time Kamala Harris takes office, if she wins the election, it's going to have fallen further. And if inflation falls, then price gouging will also fall, because it's more a byproduct of inflation than it is a cause of inflation. It definitely makes inflation worse. Don't misunderstand me, right? But inflation gives bad actors a place to hide if they want to engage in price gouging. If inflation falls, the number of places to hide falls also.
It's a little bit like if you have a piece of wood that is on fire and there's a another pile of wood next to it that's not yet on fire, it's more likely to catch on fire, or it will eventually from the heat of the initial fire. Right?
That's right.
It kind of primes the pump.
Yeah. And so if you just put the fire out, then you're probably going to be okay. And I think that's another reason why the campaign felt free to propose this, because they know that inflation is going to be less of a problem by the time they take office if they win. It'll still be something that people are concerned about, but if it keeps on falling, they won't have to worry about it so much.
But Sam, if inflation's such a huge crisis, certainly 10% tariffs across the board for all imports.
Okay.
I mean,
but
so former President Trump has proposed, as much as he proposes any policy actually in his rhetoric, has mentioned 10% tariffs across the board on all imports. This would be wildly inflationary if
that's
that was
right.
actually adopted.
However, as much as I despise Donald Trump, he's also explicitly said, right, that it's the threat of tariffs that bring other countries to the table.
That is a valid point.
It is. And mind you, if you're telling them that ahead of time, that you don't actually mean to impose these tariffs, you're just trying to get them that would seem to weaken your negotiating table if you're the
right.
author
Whereas
of
Kamala
the art
Harris
of the deal, right?
Right.
I mean,
whereas Kamala has not explicitly said, "I'll get rid of the price gouging."
She might, in fact, be a superior negotiator to Donald Trump. We don't actually know. But again, these things are topics that we'll discuss in greater detail as they become more substantive, which so far they really aren't.
Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, going to China. Keep an eye on that.
Yes.
That's good. All engagement's good, right?
Sure. I mean, it's better to keep talking to China than not talk to them.
Okay, that'll do it for this Friday's edition of Working for Crusoe. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. Have yourselves a wonderful weekend. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, everybody.